Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the forum. I'm Charles Royer, Director of the Institute of Politics, and we're pleased to offer you another in our continuing series of big events here at the Kennedy School. We've had quite a semester in terms of the forum events, and tonight will certainly be of that caliber. The forum ideas come from a number of people, from students, from others in the community, from faculty. This idea came from a member of our senior advisory committee of the Institute of Politics, which is the policy-making board of the Institute of Politics. And a member of that board, John Kennedy Jr., came up with the idea of this forum, and I will ask him to introduce his guest. John serves on the advisory committee, which was whose first chair was Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis. So the forum has the Institute's policy-making body has a decidedly Kennedy family history, and we appreciate very much his participation in this Institute of Politics, which was started by his uncle back in 1966. So would you please welcome John Kennedy.
Thank you, Charlie. I know it comes as a surprise to all of you that the Institute has a decidedly Kennedy bent to it, but such is life. For those of you who are wondering why I'm introducing Jan, you are probably not alone, and hopefully that will or may not become clear as I go through this. But Jan, who's a good friend and one who I've known a long time, started Rolling Stone magazine in 1967 in San Francisco with $7,500 and a volunteer staff of 6 or 7 people, one of whom he later married. It rose slowly, covering primarily, the San Francisco music scene, but it did always cover politics from the beginning. In 1972, Jan sent Hunter Thompson to cover the campaign between George McGovern and Richard Nixon, and also the former editor of the Harvard Crimson, Tim Krause, also worked for Rolling Stone. He wanted to cover politics, and he did so and eventually wrote another book called Boys on the Bus. Hunter Thompson, as you know, wrote Fear and Loathing on the Campaign Trail. Sometime later, I think around 1974, Rolling Stone opened its Washington bureau. Joel Klein, who now writes for New York Magazine and several others on politics, was an early writer there. Rolling Stone moved to New York in 1977, and Wenner Media, as it is now called, the stable has grown, now encompasses Us Magazine, Family Life Magazine, Outside Magazine. Their first openly political cover was the candidate Carter in 1976. And as you know, they ran recently first sitting president, President Clinton, on the last issue, and also had a cover story on him when he was a candidate. My own involvement with Jan began when I was a friend of my mother's, and I met him when I was a teenager, and he had a sort of an anarchist gleam in his eye, which distinguished him from a lot of other people that my mother introduced me to. So I always, took a liking, and we all also know Jan through Rolling Stone magazine. And someone once said that every institution is merely a shadow of its founder, and I think that certainly the same can be said for the institution that's Rolling Stone magazine. I think the message of that magazine is, from when it started, is while it was covering music, it was also covering politics, and made people realize that if you're going to be interested in music and entertainment and culture, then you have to be interested in politics, and it requires that same kind of engagement. So when, in the last campaign, when Bill Clinton was appearing on MTV and we all thought we were seeing some sort of transformation, I think it was one in which Jan was hip to a long time ago in 1972 when he sent Hunter out to cover McGovern. So I'll let him tell you about it, and please welcome Jan Wenner.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. I want to thank you, John, for that generous introduction. Little did we know that that little teenager would turn out to be such a fine young lad. And I'm very proud to be introduced by you to the world of John. I will try and be, just brief in opening remarks, and then we'll just get into questions. When I started Rolling Stone in 1967, I said in the very first editorial introducing the magazine that Rolling Stone was not going to be just about music. It was going to be about the changes and ideas that the music reflected and the music embraced. And by that, I think I meant that what was coming along in the new popular music, the new rock and roll, the Beatles, the San Francisco scene, was a music that was about a lot more than just the entertainment values in it. That this music was going to be was clearly about culture, about philosophical values, about personal ideas, psychological ideas, about the ways that young people wanted to be seen in the world, that the ways they wanted to see the world, they wanted to see the world run, about interpersonal relationships, about philosophies and ideas, some of them not the most formed, strict philosophical systems, but a way of thinking. And it was a way of thinking that was informing the so-called new generation, or the youth generation, what became known as the post-war baby boom, rising to power, going through the college system and growing up. No other media in the United States, television, newspapers, books, magazines, was really covering what was going on with this emerging generation, the biggest, brightest, best educated, wealthiest generation in the history of America, the baby boom. It was ignored. There were no magazines for young people. There were no newspapers. There was no rock and roll coverage in any of these places. Television shows were, Leave It to Beaver and Father Knows Best. There was no place young people could turn to for ideas or sharing their ideas about things and what was going on in the world around them, except through music. And this was the forum through which young people communicated to each other. The jukebox is the kind of like the electric telegraph. The radio was the closest thing to a real, genuine method of communication among young people. The establishment press attitude towards young people is that it's dangerous, too much drugs, rock and roll is terrible, bad beat, typical kind of attitude towards youth culture, which continues to this day. To me, you could take rock and roll and the emerging popular culture and the kind of youth movies that started after that and the things that started to come along on the heels of rock and roll, and through it, look and see what was going on in society. You could start to understand, the movements and trends, particularly with the post-war baby boom. I mean, the music of Dylan, was strongly anti-war. You start to read culture, and I think that has continued to be true, throughout. And I think that you can read what is going on in a political world and the world around us in some ways in a far more real sense, in a far more honest sense, through listening to the contemporary music today. And throughout this whole period since when I started, then you can sometimes by reading just the newspapers, seeing television. The most stark recent example was with the riots in Los Angeles last year. It seemed to shock everybody and take everybody by complete surprise that such a thing could happen in this day and age. There'd be such violence and such antipathy in the inner city or the ghetto or whatever you call it. All this was very readable, within a couple of years before that, if you were listening closely to rap music, the anger, the anti-police sentiment, the hatred in it, the descriptions of a kind of desperation and lives in poverty that lived there. And you could see where this anger was coming from and what it's about. And you could, if you listened to it carefully, you could probably predict, that such a thing would happen. I think, again, in general, I think, in culture we see so much more about the political world than we see, the real world in which people live, and a real way in which people take politics and respond to politics through the popular culture than you can through newspapers. Another example being Murphy Brown, which played a legitimate role of discussion about what people want to discuss about their lives and the philosophical base and the nature of the country, centered around discussion of the legitimacy of Murphy Brown's unwed child. It wasn't just something to laugh at in a political debate last time. It was a real debate over what the values of America are about. I mean, and it was conducted at that level and about that. I thought that, Rolling Stone should cover politics, partially, I guess, because I came from a very political family. But also, shortly after we started, the 18-year-old vote was enfranchised. 18-year-olds were enfranchised. The voting age was lowered, and then this, this election came up, the Nixon McGovern election, which the issues are very starkly drawn on issues of, major importance to young people, the war in Vietnam, major importance to people on the left, such as myself. So we set about we had been covering politics for a long while in sort of the New Left, and we'd written about Chicago and sent reporters there to the convention of '68. But this election was very, very important, to us. And so we sent, as John said, Hunter and Tim Krause out to cover it. In the early days of the McGovern campaign in New Hampshire, there were only 8 people following McGovern around from place to place. 2 of them were from Rolling Stone. Whether you could have predicted his later loss from that fact or not, I don't know. But we became very heavily involved in it, and we've been heavily committed to covering politics ever since. But we really got a national reputation from doing it there that year, and I've sort of been pleased to be part of it ever since. We value our tiny pulpit and our voice in national policy. We want to continue to have that. We're aware of it. We're trying to influence the debate. We take stands. We don't fully believe in this idea of objectivity. We think there's truth overrules objectivity many times. I think objectivity in the press is a thing behind which many people have hid for many years, and which would never hear the press, anybody ever in the press come out and say, Ron Ziegler lied today. It would be unobjective. But it was the truth, and it would be objective to say that, but you never heard it. I think that's breaking down. There's a lot of opinion in the press today. But anyway, we are advocates. We are passionate about what we believe in, and we report on it regularly. Anyway, having said that, I'd rather take questions.
I'd like you to comment on policies and decriminalization of drugs.
Well, we editorialized in favor of decriminalization of drugs a couple of years ago, and we strongly believe that drugs should be decriminalized. Certainly, in the most obvious case, marijuana, which this country still spends at least $1 billion a year on enforcement of those laws, which several thousands of people are still in jail for possession of marijuana, not for any other drug offenses, but for possession of marijuana. There's a kid that we've been writing about for a long time in Michigan named Gary Fannin. Is in jail on a lifetime sentence for being set up in a small cocaine buy by a DEA agent or by a local narcotics official who later was thrown off the force found out for dealing in drugs on his own behalf. And this innocent kid who set up is in jail for a lifetime. These laws, mandatory sentence, have to be reformed, but the cost of marijuana enforcement are major for meaningless thing. The real problem with drugs is that drugs is not, I think, a big problem to the middle classes and the higher status economic groups. I think people in those groups who take drugs, or get in trouble with it or take a lot of drugs, are going to end up have some kind of support system they can finally turn to when they get in trouble with it. That is their family, perhaps, a church, an educational institution, a neighborhood, an extended family, something that can help them out of it. They've got access to medical treatment, access to people who care. The problem with drugs and people who are in trouble with drugs is people who can't afford these services, don't have families, come from broken families, don't have access to economic services, don't have a church system, don't have a school system. And these are people essentially in lower economic status and in the inner cities. What do we do with these people? We spend $10 billion a year on prison space, on a criminal justice system, and that's how we treat them. We don't offer educational programs, we don't offer daycare, we don't offer anything that goes to the underlying causes of drug abuse. Instead, we just put them in jail. This is not the face that a compassionate government should present to people. What we do spend this money on this war on drugs, which we've lost, which there's no way of winning, which no reasonable drug professional will tell you we can win or have win or will win. No military. I was recently talking to the Admiral of the Atlantic Fleet, who's in charge of the drug interdiction efforts that they do in South America, and he said that they think they are getting right now, they're up to getting about 20% of the stuff that goes through. I said, well, if you were given an unlimited budget to do this, do you think what could you do? He says, well, unlimited budget, we get maybe 50%. You can go outside this building in 2 minutes and get any kind of drugs you want. I mean, I think most of the people here would know how to get it or could find it out pretty quickly. This is not the availability is everywhere. You're not going to change the nature of availability if you decriminalize. If you decriminalize, you take all the costs out of it, you lower the prices, you can reallocate that money elsewhere, and you take all the violence out of it. I think that Jocelyn Elders is on the right track. I applaud her courage for saying what she said yesterday about it. It's not a position that politicians are going to easily take. There's no percentage for them doing so. It's an easy issue for politicians to get up and scream about and say, we have to do something. We should send all these drug dealers to jail, and we should execute them. And Al D'Amato's talking about life sentences and executions for drug dealers when he's still taking $20,000 a year from the NRA. So it's an issue that is very important. The social costs, the economic costs, the psychological, the spiritual costs of this country are terrible. I equate it to the war in Vietnam. It's a quagmire. It's a war we've lost. We ought to get out of it. We ought to admit we lost and move on to other kinds of solutions on this. Whether it will happen in our lifetime, I don't know. But that's how strongly I feel about it. Supposed to go to the microphone to ask the question. Oh.
Okay, my question has to do with the latest cover of Rolling Stone. I'm an avid reader of Rolling Stone, and I appreciate the magazine's attempt to sort of, keep pushing the envelope and keep doing new things. And I was actually really upset by the latest cover, and I consider myself a liberal person. But I found that, in fact, it's a cover of, it's a picture of Cindy Crawford.
I knew you weren't referring to that Clinton cover.
Yeah. I found it sort of regressing, sort of going back to the objectified female, especially considering it is mainly a musical magazine. And I wonder what you think about that. And in addition, inside there's just a one-page thing on Billy Joel, and it refers to his wife as a personified high five. And I just wonder sort of what... I just see it as sort of a regression. I wonder what you would have to say personally.
Well, I obviously disagree with you. I don't think I'm going to be able to bring you around to my way of thinking on this either.
No, I'm listening.
I think that. Well, I think Billy characterized Christie as a high five. That was it, and it comes within the, I guess, fair treatment. If her husband wants to say what he wants to say about his wife, he should be allowed to. I guess we would extend the same privileges to her to characterize him as that little puddle of shit or whatever it is that he wants to say. About Cindy, which was my decision to put Cindy Crawford on the cover, I myself like the pictures. She's a very popular cultural figure. She has a tangential relationship to music in her MTV work, to the kinds of things we cover in terms of Richard Gere. It's legitimate cultural news, but I mean, the real issue is this is a very sexy picture of a very sexy woman on the cover. Is that that's an objectification of her as a sex object? Yes, it is. Does it sell a lot of covers of magazines? Yes. Do I object to it? No. I like it.
Good evening. My name is Ishan Zaidi. I'm a member of the Student Advisory Committee of the Institute of Politics, and on our behalf, welcome. Thank you for coming. My question has to do with the link between musicians and activism, which seems to have, died somewhere along the road. In the 60s, they had their Peter Pauls and Marys, there was Woodstock, and there was some sort of natural bond between the activist movement and the musicians, which I don't feel now. Red Hot Chili Peppers and Nirvana just don't inspire me the way some of those groups inspired the generation of the 60s. And I was wondering, how you feel about that. What has happened? Has the industry become too commercialized? Do artists not care? What are your feelings about this issue, and why has this link been severed?
Well, I don't think the link has been severed. I think the issues may be a little muddier today than they were at a time when you had that war in Vietnam, in which a pretty clear line, pretty clear dividing line could be taken. The issues are a lot more complex today. I think that though musicians remain being very activist, and I think actually more so now than they were in the 60s. I think in retrospect, it looks bigger, the connection is bigger than what it actually was. I mean, there was Bob Dylan, there was Peter, Paul, and Mary, but in the 60s, by and large, the attitude of musicians was we don't truck with politics. Politics is for the establishment. You just muddy your hands in it. It's all compromised. You know, it's not something you want to play with. Rolling Stone played a great role in trying to reshape that view of politics among musicians, saying, look, this is something to get involved in, why you should get involved in it, the fact that you can't change everything overnight, but, you know, you move the needle along. And political activism actually came to music, rock and roll music, rather slowly, despite some outstanding voices in a person of Bob Dylan. In 1972, a lot of groups played for the McGovern campaign. Not because they were particularly enamored of politics, but because it was an anti-war crusade. Today, I think you see groups involved in many more social issues and social causes you've ever seen before. I mean, there's a lot of it on AIDS. Farm Aid is one. Live Aid was the most outstanding, you know, gathering of musicians ever held at any time, I think, in history for a reason, for a cause. It was put together by rock and roll people. So actually, I think it's gotten big, and you saw a lot of musicians involved in the Clinton campaign, and playing for Clinton and showing up at the inauguration and all that stuff. It's easier for musicians to get involved when there is a passionate, singular political cause to really get with. To get into the more fragile areas where they're more complicated around the edges makes it more difficult for them. But I don't think it's been severed, and I think there's a big political conscience in music, you know.
Thanks.
I suppose this might seem a little naive. I like William Greider and I like Hunter Thompson a lot, although I don't imagine that your typical reader these days buys the magazine for those particular writers, although they may read them. But what I find in my experience when I hear that there's an article by one of those writers, and I go to take a look at the magazine to buy it, and I am overwhelmed by the advertising, just the sheer amount of the advertising, the level that there are so many of these tear-off little sort of semi-cardboard things, and it's just overwhelming. And to me, although as I say, I do like certain aspects of the magazine, pretty off-putting. Now, so the question is, how, obviously this is a realistic, somewhat hard-nosed business, how do you see balancing being able to pay good writers well, which I'm sure is an important aspect of this, something to take some pride in, I would imagine, balancing that kind of thing and being profitable to some degree with not having a magazine which, although on some level it's culturally representing something of an alternative, is, by virtue of its heavy commercial content, also not much of an alternative on some other important level, if you understand what I mean. So how do you balance that?
Well, I think that we all have to recognize the facts of the world that we live in today in the United States, and the commercialization of culture and the commercialization of media and what the economics of it. If it were possible to charge readers the kind of money that would take to support the magazine and all its writers and high quality of the graphics and the enormous costs that go into making that thing, and Bill, as wonderful he is, you know, has got a family and kids in college and needs that income, as does all the rest of the people. And there's some 250 people involved at Rolling Stone. If it was possible to share those costs with the readers, I think we would. It'd be better to do that. I'd love to have that independence and a little less advertising. It doesn't work that way for many reasons. Structurally, having to do with the way the newsstand distribution system works, the returns patterns, the fact that it's a monopoly business, all kinds of things. You know, I mean, it's too complicated to get into, but suffice to say it's real. That the real profitability of the magazine comes from its advertising, except for very small magazines of small circulation that don't have those kind of graphics, generally don't have that level of writers, and are very thin and somewhat less than, you know, can't afford, say, the kind of reporting that we can do and so forth. It just can't be done to do that kind of product. I would rather not have all those things falling out, too. Also, but on the other hand, I think a number of other readers like a lot of that advertising. A lot of it has a lot of informational value. I do want to see what the latest records are. I do want to see some of the latest products. So there's a lot of the advertising I don't like, but it also has its own purpose and a service. It's the world we live in. It's the nature of art in the United States. Art is commercial.
Are there any limits at all to the level or the degree of advertising or kind of advertising?
There's some, but not certainly to the level. I'll take, frankly, take as much as we can. But the amount of editorial content rises in relationship to the amount of advertising. And then the next issue we're working on is going to be a very small issue because of the post-Christmas ad slump. And it's distressing not to have enough advertising to put all the articles I would like to put in that particular issue.
Hi, my name is Matt Anestis, and I'm an undergrad at the college and a member of the Student Advisory Committee at the Institute of Politics. And my question is about the Clinton interview that you did in the recent issue. You said he was at his most presidential when he got angry and talked about how he didn't get enough help from the liberal press. And it was a very positive article and portrayed Clinton as very presidential and wasn't particularly critical about many of his policies. And my question to you is whether or not you think that Clinton's right and he deserves help from the liberal press, and whether or not your article was an attempt at such help.
Our article was an attempt to allow him the opportunity to portray himself in the most honest and accurate light that he could portray himself. And this is the characteristic of the Rolling Stone interview in general. I think it characterized this particular interview with Clinton as well as the interview we did with him when he was a candidate a year earlier in Little Rock, in which we're going in and trying to conducting an interview which is not about the latest, head count in Congress on NAFTA. In fact, we stayed away from that altogether and what the latest political ins and outs are, but an attempt to sort of understand what his thinking is, what his problems are, what he's like, what he's looking forward to, and therefore we ask him the kind of questions that elicit that kind of stuff. Are you having fun? What's the thing you've learned the most about yourself since you've been here? And these kind of questions give you a look at him, since he will honestly respond to any question you ask him, rather than in a more classic political politician kind of thing, give you a kind of a canned answer that they've been using again and again that you can see is just glazed over their face. Gave you real insight into who he is and what he was. And then we also engage him in a series, I think, of pretty tough questions, responding to the kinds of feelings I think that people, particularly his supporters, were having at that time, who were feeling pretty disappointed in him. And there was a lot of disappointment around at that time in the country about why hadn't this promise come through, why this pledge, he'd been, and part of it was the reason people were disappointed is that certain things he had promised hadn't come through. There were some pretty strong, big compromises that had taken place. And partially the way it'd be portrayed in the press. I mean, the press was covering everything that went wrong very heavily. I mean, Clinton made this point in there, but when in the very first place, when the Democrats lost the $18 billion job creation bill, which was the first big piece of legislation he put in front of the Congress, the coverage of that didn't focus on the fact that that all this money that would have created summer jobs, in our cities and so forth, had been squandered. That the Republicans had defeated a bill which would have given poor kids jobs. And maybe it did have some pork in it. But what all the coverage is how clever and how smart and how strong Bob Dole was as leader for having swacked this back. So I mean, and that kind of coverage is, was pretty consistent throughout the Clinton up till this NAFTA victory. I mean, that was it. I went down for the signing of the motor voter bill, and a very popular piece of legislation, which had been, vetoed by the Bush administration. They staged a huge event for the signing, to bring out the press. There was not a word of it in the press that this had been accomplished. Now, I think the question that goes to whether he's right or wrong at the end, at the conclusion of the interview, is this the press's, how much is the press fault and how much is his fault? And I think what the president doesn't recognize at this point, and still has yet to recognize and should, is that it's not altogether the fault of the press. It's the nature of the press to pick up negative stuff, and it's a better story, and we all know that kind of thing. But what about the White House's ability to promote these stories and make these stories come out? What had they done wrong to the press that they had gotten no honeymoon whatsoever, which is traditional, has been traditional with every president in modern times? Was it that the press was particularly negative this year? Nasty, I don't think so. The press is the same beast, same pack of dogs and wolves that needs to be fed stories at the right time and needs to be petted and taken care of and being nice to. They've been there a long time. They've been there before many other presidents. They're going to be there after the presidents. They have their problems. They weren't doing that. They treated the press very shabbily. They brought that on themselves. They handled it very poorly. And since we're on C-SPAN, I'm not naming names tonight. So I think that when the president got very angry at his handling of the press, I think partially he's correct. I think the press has misrepresented him. Now they've turned around. Now we're full of, the paper's been full of a year assessment and actually what a good job he did and how many bills he did get passed, and all because of the NAFTA thing. The press has usually jumped on a bandwagon. I think partially also in response to what Clinton said in Rolling Stone, you know, and his complaint about it, maybe his threat that if you cover me badly, I'll yell at you too, you know. So I think that his assessment is fair to a great degree. I think he has been misrepresented. And he was particularly upset because he'd been misrepresented people to whom his presidency represents a lot of hope and a lot of chance and a lot of possibility. And that, I think, got him upset. But it's also natural for a president to be upset at the press. They always have been in Washington, and it's always going to be that way. I mean, they're unrelentingly critical. So you're going to have to just rise above it. But I thought it was great when he yelled and got angry. And the response of the people who read the interview and from our readers is pretty strong. We thought, this is a pretty sympathetic portrait of the president. And he came off very, very well in that interview. I mean, you really could understand what his thinking is, what his problems are.
Thank you. I also want to ask about your coverage of Clinton. You've had him on 2 covers in the last 15 or so months. And I'm just wondering, between the time of the first and the second interview, he had to make a lot of compromises on issues that you care about. And I'm wondering if you respect him more or less now, or if your view of him hasn't changed at all.
I respect him more having done that interview and having read that interview, where we went in there and asked him about these compromises, you know, on a number of fronts, and asked him some pretty tough questions. Was he, for instance, are you squandering the opportunity as the first post-Cold War president to really make a fundamental change in the budgeting of this nation and the defense budget, and take that huge amount of money and reorient it towards the kind of spending that's necessary to repair this country? And I mean, tough stuff. And he gave an account. He said, look, in general, I want to do all these things, and he specifically on campaign reform, explained why he couldn't get all these things done at once, and what the process is, and how it's necessary. He said, look, I have to all the time decide what it takes to get one, you know, the half the vote plus one, and whether it's better to, you know, stand on principle and get nothing, you know, or get something. And he explores these dilemmas. I felt much better about him having done that interview than I had before. I was worried before. Now I'm much more confident, really.
So you think he has the proper balance between idealism and practice, pragmatism?
I don't know how to exactly define what's proper, but he has a balance, and he's well aware of what that balance is, and that it is a balance.
Okay, thanks.
You've been asked this a million times before, but I'm going to ask you again. What do you say to people who say, you're no longer the voice of the anti-establishment, Jan Wenner? You're the establishment. You're a part of it all.
I think, I don't know if is that good applause or
One
bad
support.
applause? Or, I think that, you know, what's happened over the last 20 years is kind of sort of alternate culture, counterculture, you know, has moved more towards the middle, and certainly the middle has moved more towards it. So it's almost merged. I mean, there's almost no distinction anymore. There's no possibility really for a counterculture, alternate culture, for it, whether it's in arts, for example. I mean, if some new artist came along and had some new interesting thing he was just working on down Soho, you know, before he had a chance to say boo, there would be, you know, 3 television stations down there covering 5 cable networks, arts and entertainment, the New York Post, and everybody, all the cultural writers around the country, Rolling Stone, people, all be there looking at, you know, this new thing. It's not working that way anymore. But yes, we're part of the establishment, and I'm part of the establishment, and I'm frankly happy about it now. You know, I yesterday was sitting with Kathleen Brown, who is a year older than me. She's going to run for governor of California. She's a terrific person. She espouses the kind of values that I've stood for all my life. She believes in all those things. She's a real person. She could be sitting in this room with all of us, any of us here. You would turn to her. She is somebody you know and you like from your own life. And she's going to run for one of the toughest races in the country and one of the most expensive campaigns against a tough opposition. She's going to fight what is undoubtedly going to be a typical Republican dirty tricks, negative campaign, you know, in a state that invented them, for a state that is going to have enormous high stakes in the 96 presidential election, you know. And I'm happy to be able to be in a place to be able to help her. You know, and if that's being part of the establishment, I'm thrilled. You know, but it's appropriate to my age. It's not appropriate necessarily to somebody at 18. And the role of younger people is to challenge everything. And as we get older and, you know,
It
there's a
happens.
different role. Is that, do I have to use the word sellout or something? No.
Hi. First of all, I want to remind you of Ms. Magazine, no advertising, fabulous writers. So, and I guess they're doing all right.
They're not doing all right, though. That's the point. They have come to the brink. They have stopped publication 3 or 4 times. They teeter towards the bankruptcy, and it's great. I mean, that's a road they have chosen to go. You know, for their standards and what they want to accomplish on their terms, and I applaud it. And it's a lot. And it's a tougher road, if not tougher, than the road that I'm on. You know, but there are different roads, and we can all should have the opportunity to choose different roads. Some more commercial, some less commercial. And there's Mother Jones and a bunch of others. But
Okay.
I didn't mean to interrupt. I'm just sensitive on that
It's all
point.
right.
Overly sensitive.
Let's see. Oh yeah, I found it somewhat disturbing for you to hear you say, yes, this objectifies, you know, Cindy Crawford, and no, I don't mind. I'm wondering, I'm very interested in, well, you've spoken a lot tonight about the activism that Rolling Stone has done in the past, and I guess I'm very interested in what is the magazine's vision in terms of freedom of speech, censorship, political correctness, and responsibility, just sort of, you know, how do you draw the line, and does the magazine have a vision? I mean, I open up, you know, you open up a magazine and it'll have an article about eating disorders, and then on the next page, you know, 30 days to thinner thighs. So this kind of almost hypocrisy that you know, you talk, well, anyway, I'm interested in hearing about.
We have never run an article called 30
No,
Days to
no,
Thinner
that
Thighs.
was just an example of the, well, you should. It's just
Okay. But we feel very, very strongly about that we have a social purpose, and we have a belief system, and we're very strongly committed to social justice in this country, and to the political process. And we have been covering all kinds of issues. We can't do it 100% of the time. We can't do it 100% correctly. And I'm not going to want to sit and give you a long list of things I can't even remember some of them anymore. But I would put our record for covering progressive causes, backing progressive causes, all kinds of movements for equal rights, up against any magazine in the country and up against any newspaper in the country. And I feel very strongly, I'm very proud of what we've done. And they range in all kinds of ways. And we remain committed to that, and we remain committed to that, you know, for as long as I own and run the magazine. And I think it's part of what the magazine is, and why the magazine has such a big readership. I mean, in addition to its quality and its level of reporting and its instinct for what's popular and what's good in popular culture, is that the magazine stands for something. It does believe in something. I mean, I agree that it can be criticized around the edges, and we're not perfect, and you may have a quarrel with the Cindy Crawford cover, which is fine, but I don't think you have a quarrel with, you know, the Bill Clinton cover, the very first stuff ever published anywhere in any magazine about AIDS that we won awards for opening it up. And sure, you know, we're commercial, and sure, we run some advertising you may not like and all that kind of stuff, and that's fine, but the fact that it does stand for something, it means a lot to me, and I know it means a lot to our readers. And we put a lot of money, a lot of time, and a lot of effort into it.
I understand you have to pick your battles, you know, wisely, but in an industry that is so, you know, misogynistic and so, you know, male-dominated, I would really like to see some of the magazines taking some kind of a stand on women's behalf. Just, for instance, recently, you know, there's a lot of hype about rap music and, you know, bitch and hoe and Jimmy this and, you know, and then you can have a feature on AIDS. But what do you think that you play any kind of role in I mean, what becomes popular, you know? I want to know about responsibility and where you, like, what do you think of censorship and freedom of speech, you know, and responsibility?
You
where does
raised
that
the
fall
issue
on the continuum?
Yeah, I mean, you posed the issue very nicely there. I mean, you've got what do you in fact do about rap music? I mean, it's got a lot of language, and it's offensive, it's sexist, it's misogynist. it's violent, it's degrading, you know. I mean, on the other hand, do you censor it? I mean, do you believe in that it should be censored? It's not a legitimate art form. It's not the popular voice of some people that it shouldn't be played or shouldn't be issued. You know, how do you balance that? I mean,
Well, how does the magazine balance it? That's something that I think is going to really come to
Well,
a head in our time. And
I think we treat it within the, you know, within the framework of what our mission is in terms of covering music, covering popular art, culture, and politics. And that rap music, as I said before, is at the nexus of those things and has got a lot of valid stuff about it. And for the obnoxious stuff, I mean, I'm sure that in our review section we've said, you know, this often, many times said that, you know, the other stuff about women is really ugly and, you know, it should be dispensed with. And there's certain parts of it that are very valuable.
I guess my question is about something very similar to the woman before me. I was wondering what you think, or actually whether you think that the violence in a lot of contemporary music and the extreme violence in our society are linked. And if they are linked, I was wondering how can you justify to yourself the cover stories and writing articles about groups that promote violence and giving them this additional publicity and legitimacy in the eyes of the American public?
Well, you know, I don't like some of these videos that are misogynist and violent, especially as a father of young children. I don't think they're particularly healthy. However, what they have to do with actually causing violence escapes me. I saw a cartoon recently, which we ran in Rolling Stone, in which Janet Reno is asked, well, who's responsible for that fire, for the Waco incident? And she goes, Beavis and Butthead. You know, and a whole bunch of things are blamed on Beavis and Butthead. The problem, violence in our society is not created by television. It's not created by rock music. It's not created by rock music videos. Violence in our society has got three causes: unemployment, drugs, and the availability of guns. And to go out, and I find it reprehensible, the Attorney General of the United States, to go start attacking television. Television violence has been around for decades and decades and decades, you know, and movie violence and all those things. These are the real problems elsewhere. There was an incident where some kid got shot recently, several months ago, and I believe it was in this area, because a police officer, the kid was holding a plastic gun. It looked realistic. The police officer shot him because he thought he was being threatened by a real gun. So the move of the politician the next day was that they ought to ban toy guns. Well, the toy gun didn't kill anybody. The guns kill, you know, and so as much as I don't particularly approve of seeing this stuff on television, it makes me cringe, it's not the problem. These are the other problems. It's easy enough for politicians and rhetoricians or whatever, and people on soapboxes to get up there and attack the TV networks, you know, and attack violence in the media, who are really reflecting a violent society fundamentally, because nobody's going to fight them on it. You know, it's a popular cause. Great. You know, there's no constituency out there, no organized group saying, wait, we want violence on television. But it's a lot tougher to go out there and attack the gun lobby, talk about the budget and putting money in the hands of poor people and raising the minimum wage so we can get back to a decent standard of living for people who are living hopeless lives in ghettos and have no reason not to kill somebody, you know, and do something about the drug problem, you know, which is where most of the violence, and this recent violence upsurge is, and the goddamn problem of guns. And it's time to start cleaning them up. You know, and if you want a reduction in violence in society, attack those problems and get off of TV. It's not the problem.
So you don't think the constant depiction of violence on TV and in the rest of the media at least legitimizes violence or makes it seem more acceptable or commonplace at all?
Oh, I agree with all that. You know, I mean, I agree. It's not helpful. You know, it's not good. I speak to you as a father of children. I don't want my young children growing up seeing all this stuff, and it's hard to avoid it, whether they're watching cartoons or the news, or what have you. I mean, they're fascinated with the Terminator and these very violent images at Hollywood. You know, which is far more violent, by the way, the movie business than the television business. I don't like it, but I know it's not the problem. You know, I know it's not but as the president was saying in Hollywood a couple nights ago, they should clean up their act a little. It's not a good image for people who are in otherwise hopeless and desperate situations to see. You know, it's too much, you know, it's too role model-y for a lot of kids. But in desperate situations, but again, I say to you, if we have a limited amount of time, we have a limited amount of resources, and we have a limited amount of space in which to make political speeches and make talks, the real causes are not television violence. And those people who are obsessed with that, you know, are really dealing with the symptom. They're not dealing with the problem. The problem is elsewhere. The problem is a lot more difficult. It's a lot more complicated. It's costly financially. It's costly politically. You know, but that's where it is. And the rest is hypocrisy. And I don't admire a senator like Paul Simon, who otherwise think is fine, getting up on a high horse and talking about it. Why doesn't he talk about the real problem? Put these kids back to work so they don't have to go out and kill people. That's what it is. That's where it is.
Thank you.
Okay, to talk about rock and politics and your role as a media to take charge of the politics that are raised by rock and roll, no? Undoubtedly, all over the world, the music has shaped up the generations. The young people are all, they all have a spiritual, political culture that has been geared by all sorts of music, no? From a shanty town in South Africa to a slum in Mexico to Moscow. The young people have all in their souls the lyrics from John Lennon, Imagine, from Bob Marley, The Rebellion, the anger from U2, and Midnight Oil, and all these things that have been for many years shaping up the minds of the young people. No? And then somehow you as a media, I think, are failing to address the current, no? The spark that would make the young people live up to those ideals that have been engraved in us by listening to all this music for so many years. No? And somehow I was pretty depressed when I heard your answer to that question, that you're very satisfied or you feel okay of being part of the establishment now, no? When rock and roll was probably born on this mission of unconformity, of revolution. Something is very wrong with the world, and we all know it, no? Who doesn't get chills when he listens to John Lennon, Imagine, you know, as one example. And I really do think that you are failing to address this issue, no? To responsibly take charge of this compromise that you have. Maybe you don't have it because you're just Rolling Stone magazine. Maybe you do.
Well, I certainly agree with you and your passionate description of the power of music politically and what it's meant to young people, and not just young people, but older people around the world, from Bob Marley to John Lennon, U2, the shanty towns, the people imprisoned in Africa for singing popular music. I, of course, disagree with you that Rolling Stone somehow not representing it or selling it out. I mean, these are the names of the people that we cover, that we put on the cover of the magazine, that we champion, that we review, that we interview, that we know, that we like. You know, I'm just, my feelings, I'm very proud of everything, you know, of the role we've played in that, and the role we played in politicizing music and championing the most political of the artists around the world today. I mean, they've always been among Rolling Stone's favorites. Those are the ones we've always backed. We're not a heavy metal magazine. We are the magazine that, you know, that is the magazine of U2, and is the magazine of Bob Marley. But the word establishment, I guess, is a kind of a loaded word to use. But I mean, I think there's, you know, there's establishments that are bad and there's establishments that are good. I think a good new establishment is taking shape, which I'm pleased to be a part of. And whether that's Kathleen Brown or certain things I like about the Clinton administration, again, it's politics in a complex society. I mean, just because I buy a part of it doesn't mean I buy into all of it, you know, but there's parts of it I like a lot, you know, and that part I'm proud. Now, I bet you there's going to be things that Kathleen Brown says on a campaign trail that I'm not going to agree with, but it doesn't mean I'm going to entirely disavow the idea that she'd be a great governor for California and she'd be better than her opponent and be good to have her in office. But, you know, I think we've been doing our job great, but this is what makes the world turn around.
Okay, the world turns around, but somehow you came back again and focusing in America, no? And your role in the American society. Somehow your magazine and your comments break the barriers, no? They go throughout the world. Your magazine is popular all over the globe, no? They pay 10 times its price in Moscow, and not to mention other places. And somehow this issue of orienting the people to respond, no, to react to this system which is wrong. I mean, the world is wrong. The governments are mistaken, don't you think so? That's the message of all these guys that you promote. And somehow...
Well, I don't know what to say. I mean, our concerns are primarily American. That's what we cover. I realize the magazine is read around the world. I think we try and cover the most positive aspects of American society, which is actually, which is the leadership society in the world, in which most of the world, certainly the young people in the world take their cues from American young people, and American culture leads the world culture, and American politics dominates world politics. We're certainly supportive of the good parts of it, negative about the bad parts of it. I hope that message gets out.
My name is Gene Downer, and I am also a graduate student at the Harvard School of Public Health. And I was glad that my fellow student, the physician from Mexico City, expressed his question right before mine, because it does tie in some way to it. I published a magazine in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, and have worked with Bob Wallace on some things when he was doing Rocky Mountain magazine. As part of my graduate study, I've developed a program for using popular entertainers and athletes as role models to encourage healthy behavior among adolescents. Okay. To what extent do you feel the behavior of stars, rock stars, athletes, influence the behavior of adolescents?
To a good extent. I think that, they're definitely role models. Certainly stylistically, and fashion, all the stuff that they imitate and mimic. Fashion's long hair, jeans, earrings, whatever it is. I think the rock and roll community and the community of athletes are very conscious and very aware of it, and the majority of them really are trying to send out positive messages. I mean, you get, many more rock stars involved in anti-drug messages than you do get involved than are out, promoting it. Athletes clearly are trying to put out anti-drug messages. Yeah, they're influential. And I think they're trying to do their best. There's certainly bad elements, but what can you do about that? There's time for one or two more questions.
Thank you.
I do agree that music is very reflective of our society, but in some ways, especially rap, because it's becoming mainstream, it's not only affecting the black community, it's affecting a lot of other upper middle class communities and everything. And I recently read an article in Newsweek about executives and their irresponsibility in terms of what kind of rap music they they let be released. And I was wondering if Rolling Stone has or is ever going to take a stand in terms of, of course it's great that everybody has the chance to express themselves, but there is a point where it is effective and it can be destructive.
Well, I think we've consistently decried the anti-feminine, the misogynist aspects of this particular music. But I tell you, there's aspects of it very important, culturally, socially, predictive, and that this music is permitted under the Constitution of the United States, full freedom, and
right.
That should not be restricted. And the minute a record company fires a rap group like they did when Warner dumped Ice-T, all the civil libertarians are up in arms saying this is an attempt to squish this music. Now you want it squished. My feeling is it can't be squished, and don't try.
Well, I don't think it should be squished, but I do think that there's a limit. When you have an artist like
if
Tupac.
you want to go limiting speech, go ahead. I'm against limiting speech.
In terms of when there's
I don't
things
care
that
what
happen,
they say. As
but
bad
what
as an
about kids who
unpleasant
kill
it is, I'm an
because-
ACLU type of person. As bad and as unpleasant as that speech may be, and as excessive, is the price of free speech in a society. And the value of free speech in a society far outweighs the need to shut down little unpleasantries on the side of it. It can't be done.
Unpleasantries. I'm talking about like murder. Murder is not just an unpleasantry.
We can't rehash this. I mean, I sympathize.
Hi, my name is Carolyn Scher, and I'm a student here at Harvard University. And one thing you mentioned as you were speaking was that you favored decriminalizing marijuana. I realize the economic benefits of that. I mean, as far as, you know, not spending as much money on prisoners just for marijuana. However, I have a funny feeling that that would have a negative effect on society, and I want to know why you think that that wouldn't.
I think there would be negative effects on society of decriminalization. I think it would make all these things slightly more available than they are now. And I think that there are prices to pay for drug use. My point, and bad prices, and I'm not in favor of most drug use. My point is this: the stuff is so available right now that the cost of this failed attempt to make it less available have not produced less availability. All they've done is make higher prices, added a huge criminal cost and violence element, and have prevented the government from allocating a budget to really clean up the real causes of drug addiction. So I'm not out here advocating more use of this stuff. But you look at, you know, societies like Amsterdam and other, in Holland, and places where they have these kind of policies, they don't have these kinds of crime rates that we have in the United States. And it's just a practical thing. We've lost the war. It was an unwinnable war. We have never, you know, the people, you know, there's alcoholism in the United States. Alcohol is legal. It's taxed by the government, but there are no longer wars over alcohol. People are not getting shot dead like the Untouchables anymore. Alcoholism has a high cost to society, right? There are people in hospitals. You know, there's all these kinds of things. It's bad, but it's not stoppable. You cannot prohibit it, and we ought to learn that lesson.
Well, I do understand that, but it just seems that I just don't. I think it's kind of sad that an influential man such as yourself, with the Rolling Stone magazine, I think it's kind of sad that you would say that we've lost that war, because, you know, what's society going to come to? It hasn't been lost. There's still hope, I think, and I think that maybe, I mean, I'm not saying rethink your policies or anything, but it's just very sad that the press and someone such as yourself would feel that.
Well, I think there are a number of people who have got, you know, real knowledge on this subject and real practical experience, who've studied this very hard and have come to this conclusion. It's not a casual conclusion. It's not an abandonment of society. It's not a pathetic thing. It's a real thing. We are paying enormous prices, socially, economically, and morally, for this failed war on drugs. And it's got to stop. And we've got to deal with it in a real way. And it's the same thing with television. Television doesn't cause violence. It's simple. The political hypocrisy, which is not going to end this year on these two subjects, or next year, sooner or later we will get around to dealing with people in a more humane sense as the way they really are. You know, and it's the same is true with sexual politics too. You know, it's the same forces at work, and the hypocrisy on sexual politics has started to fade away. You know, and now we have, you know, freedom of choice back. You know, so the needle will move. But believe me on this, I do know what I'm talking about. One more question.
Hi, my name's Nikki.
Friendly question.
Oh,
good.
Very friendly. Okay, big smile. My name's Nikki Columbus, and I'm an undergraduate here at Harvard. And I know you touched on earlier the subject of Clinton and, you know, things like MTV inaugural ball, and I wanted to just ask you about various programs that are done to get youth involved, such as the MTV coverage of the election and things such as Rock the Vote, and that has just recently increased in this past presidential election. And I was wondering whether you thought that these efforts were successful in getting the youth of America involved in politics, or if you think it's just the first step towards something else, or whatever.
I think they're really good. They're really commendable. I think they have moved the needle. I think young people's involvement in politics is good. It's very hard for young people to get involved in politics because they rightfully look at the behavior of politicians and what goes on in society and are rather cynical about it, as they should be, because there's a lot of cynical stuff going on in Washington that is really blood-chilling, you know, as to what some of the judgments and trade-offs that are being made there and what some of these people we've elected actually do. Any young person who comes up and says they're cynical about it, doesn't want to be part of the process, it's hard to argue them out of it. It's hard not to say to them, you know, you're right, what you see on TV is relatively truthful. These people are selling you down the river. They're far more interested in GE than they in your life, you know. So, on the other hand, so when a young person makes the difficult step, and is encouraged to make that step by whether it's something that's seen on MTV or read in Rolling Stone, or it's because the President of the United States has done something that says, I'm interested in your life, either because I like your music or because I'm setting up a National Service Corps or affects them in some way directly, and a young person decides, well, maybe my little bit, my little part will make a difference, and I can help move things along, whether it's at my local level, in my community, or some non-political cause that I believe in, or something like that, or at the national level. I applaud it, and I think it's sensational. That's part of what Rolling Stone is all about, and has been all about for years, and will continue to be all about. And so I'm for people getting involved in politics. I think it can make a difference, however small. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.